Hey guys, Chris at the Ultimate Recycler. Here's a vintage Victa two-stroke lawnmower. Victa were famously made in Australia, I think in Sydney in the 1950s. I think by Merv Richardson, if I remember my history correctly. Feel free to correct that if I'm wrong. This mower dates to probably 1975 or 76. It was known as the VC Mustang, which would have had a decal on there originally. It's the older style Victa engine, well, the 70s era engine. This one has you can't really tell because it's covered in oil and everything, but that's the plastic carby. The earlier ones, once you get to 1974 and earlier, they had a die-cast metal carby with a air vane governor. This one has a diaphragm type governor in that cap there. It's been dropped off at my shop just for scrap. I mean, I take e-waste here, and even though this isn't electrical, people have got wind of the fact that I like to save things from going to landfill, and I dabble in scrap metal a little bit, and so the guy was happy to drop it off. Now, he said the engine actually runs. He didn't say how well, but there's no grass flap on the back there, so it would have been incredibly dangerous to use. There was a piece of old hay band across here with a bit of a bag hanging down, which is fairly agricultural. It would have probably stopped the grass going in your face, but a decent stone would have gone straight through the bag and probably be very painful. Anyway, this video is about what we can do with it. Is there any scrap value? Can we get better value elsewhere? It is 1975, so that's what, 45 years old. These are starting to become collectible. This one has a cast aluminium deck, and it's got a piece broken out of the front there. And if we pan around this side, I did notice there was a crack. Not really obvious, but there's a crack running up the side. So I don't think the base is worth saving. If it had been undamaged, I think I would have saved it. But we'll pull it apart. We'll see what scrap value there is. The wheels, even though they're a bit rough, I can still sell the wheels. There's no scrap value, they're only plastic. The cast aluminium deck will add up to a few dollars. The engine itself, we'll have a look in there. I'll show you a few tips on establishing how good a condition an engine is without actually pulling it right down. And I think that'll be saleable for parts or repair. It's not going to be worth very much for scrap, but we'll look at all that. For a start, we'll weigh the thing completely as it is. If we were going to drop it off at the scrapyard as dirty shred steel, or you could probably get away with putting it in the irony aluminium pile because the deck is all aluminium. If the deck was a pressed steel, it would go as shred steel. But we'll get a weight on it and we'll just have a look at what it's worth as it is, and then we'll start pulling it down, and I'll show you a few things and we'll work out some different options for selling. Okay, I've got the mower balanced up here on the bathroom scales. I'm kind of holding it one hand, but it'll give us a reasonably accurate weight. And if we can read the bathroom scales there upside down, it looks like 22 kilos, about 3.5 stone, but we'll work in kilograms. So I'll put it down and we'll make a few notes. So if we send it off for dirty shred steel, what did we say, 22 kilos? Don't know why I asked you, you won't be able to answer me. Dirty shred, let's say 10 cents a kilo. I think it's a little bit better than that at the moment. And that would give us $2.20. Now, irony aluminium is going to pay a lot more. We've still got a 22 kilos, and it's around about 4 times the amount, about 40 cents a kilo at the moment on a price check I had just last week. So that's going to be 4 times that is $8.80. So certainly much better to send it off for aluminium, but as I said, if your mower's got a pressed steel deck, then you're only going to get your shred steel price. So I think we can do a lot better than $8.80, given that we can sell the wheels. They won't be worth a lot, but the engine, if it checks out, is going to be better value for parts or repair. But we'll strip it down for the aluminium deck because that's damaged and I don't think it's worth saving. We'll keep a track of our time. So we'll start by getting the cowlings off, and then I'll show you a few tricks about getting the blade off underneath, the disc. And most Australian mowers will tip it over. A lot of Australian made mowers had a disc underneath with swing blades, so that when you hit something solid, the blade will actually swing back out of the road. Not that you should mow things solid, but sometimes there's a brick in the grass or a bit of a water pipe you couldn't see in long grass. A lot of the American made mowers had just a solid bar blade, and the risk with those is that there's no give. If you hit something solid with the bar blade, you can actually bend the crankshaft on the motor, whereas these ones do go a long way to protecting that. Anyway, I'll show you a couple of tricks on getting that off. We'll probably take the wheels off and the cowling off first, and we'll check in as we go. So I decided to leave the wheels on for now, just in case some of you find this video and you're restoring an old mower and you don't necessarily want to pull the wheels off. So we'll leave them on till last. I've taken the cowling off. It has got a burn section here from the muffler. It's melted a bit, so I'm not going to worry about keeping that. As with the deck, if it had been in good order, I might have saved it, but I don't think it's worth saving. These mowers, even though they're 45 odd years old, they're not rare. There's quite a lot of them still around in sheds. I think Victa, as far as the company goes, sold many thousands of these mowers. They were quite popular in the 70s. First things first, right, let's take the fuel tank out. The fuel tap was actually left on. The guy said it was running, but I don't know how long ago, because there's no fuel in the tank and the tap was left on, and this bracket just lifts out. So you can see the engine's pretty accessible. Before we do any work with the blades or underneath, always a good habit to disconnect the spark plug lead. The last thing you want is for you spinning the blades underneath and it gets a bit of a spark in the cylinder, and there may be a bit of fuel in there and it might give a kick or a fire, and that could be very dangerous. So when I say fire, I mean the engine actually might try to start. Alright, now that we've got that off, I'll show you some tricks as to getting this plate off. We have one large nut there which hasn't been moved for a long time. They can be extremely tight. It's also got a little bit of string wrapped around the thread. I'm going to put a little bit of spray on that, a bit of spray lube. And we need to stop that whole disc spinning, obviously, to undo the nut. So I've seen people jam screwdrivers into the fins of the flywheel, which is really a no-no, because you can actually, the fins are aluminium and they break off quite easily. You can damage the posts that hold the ignition coil, so you're better off leaving the top end right alone. And we need to hold the disc. Now you could jam a piece of wood to one side and that works quite successfully. If you've got a relatively new mower, it'll be different to this, but you can sometimes just hold the disc by hand and give the nut a bit of a jar, or by using an impact driver or something. But this one's going to be very tight, so we're going to take the spark plug out and grab a bit of rope. There's the spark plug out. It's very dry, so the mower clearly hasn't been run for quite a while. Believe it or not, I couldn't find any rope. I just went to my shed and all I was after was some starter rope like this one. And I'm not going to cut this because we want to leave the engine intact, assuming that it checks out okay. But being an e-waste scrapper, the next best thing, I just scrapped out a vacuum this morning and I have a nice long cord. It will do the same job as the rope. So what we're going to do is we're going to feed it into the cylinder. Make sure it's clean, of course. And we can move the piston down to the bottom of its stroke so we give a bit of room in there. And we'll push the cord in. It'll coil around in the cylinder. Now when the piston gets to top dead center and fires, there's very little room at the top of the cylinder because it compresses all the fuel air mixture up to a tiny space. So that will be plenty of cord to stop the piston travelling to the top, which means it will stop the engine rotating. Okay, I think you can see there. So if we turn the disc, it stops. It stops solid. Now the cord's soft enough that it's not going to do any damage, and it's going to lock the engine nice and tight so that we can undo the nut. I'll put a bit of spray on that and I'll leave it. I've run out of time today, so I'm just going to spray it and I'll leave it soak, and we'll get back to this job tomorrow. Okay, it's the next day. We'll get back to this mower job. Now, before we attempt the undoing of the base plate with the electrical cord in the cylinder, I just thought I'd demonstrate a couple of the other things I've mentioned. You can use a piece of wood, and I'll just quickly cut a piece here. Because these base plates, these discs are elliptical, they're not perfectly round, you could easily jam one in the housing like that, which will then stop the plate turning. You do have to watch that there's no excessive pressure on a weak part of the deck that would crack it, but that does work quite successfully. That bit of wood could actually have been a little bit longer, but you see what I'm meaning there, and it's a good way of holding the disc. The other method, if the nut is well and truly rusted, and you can see I've had this soaking overnight, if it just simply won't budge with any of these other methods, you can try a cold chisel, but you would need to support the crankshaft. So I've just got a bit of metal here to demonstrate. You would need something thicker, and you would need to do this perhaps on a concrete floor. But if you supported the base of the nut and then struck it on the flat with a cold chisel, it will support the crankshaft. If you didn't have the support, you'd possibly bend the crank. So it's getting a little bit extreme, this, but it is a way of getting the nut off. And what I'd do is give it a couple of sharp taps with a cold chisel there. I would then rotate it and do another flat, and I'd work my way around the nut, and that will jar the thread so that it will undo. You can't really use heat in this situation, because what will happen is the heat will travel up the crankshaft and it'll, I don't know if we can quite see it in there, it'll most likely melt the seal. If this was a 4-stroke engine, damaging the seal would mean you'd get an oil leak underneath your mower, and it would need replacing. If it was a 2-stroke, which this one is, damage in the crank seal causes much more problems. It will cause hard starting. The engine could run hot because it'll be running leaner. It will suck air through the crankcase. So 2-strokes are a lot different in their crankcase than what a 4-stroke is. Either way, you really don't want to damage the oil seal. So that's a bit of just a bit of information on trying to get that nut off if it is super tight. But the wood method works quite well, and the blocking the piston seems to work very well too. So I haven't tried to undo this, I've just left it soaking. I have seen other YouTube videos where they demonstrate how to undo rusted nuts and that sort of stuff, and I'll bet last week's pay that 99% of the time they actually undid them first and did them back up so that they made sure it would come undone. But this is a genuine test, so I'll put the camera in the stand and we'll see if we can get the nut off. I have got a correct size ring spanner. You could also use a socket. Don't use a shifter or even an open-ended spanner, because it's going to slip off and you'll damage the nut and damage your fingers most likely. Okay, now we're ready to give this a go. We'll spin it round until the piston hits the cord. It'll be a little bit spongy as it squashes the cord up, but that's quite firm there. And I'm going to need an extension on this spanner. So I have a piece of pipe here. We'll start the angle a little bit higher. And the nut should undo with a bit of effort. We'll see how we go. And there we go. Just a bit of a bounce on the spanner tends to work well, I find. And once you crack it, it's usually pretty easy to undo. So now we can take our disc out. We haven't damaged the nut, we haven't damaged the thread. You can see there was that string or rope that got around the thread, but it's coming off as we undo the nut. And there we go. Now, just while we're at this stage, if you were pulling the engine apart, this boss that holds the blade plate, and it has a slotted washer that goes onto these two notches here. The way to get those off is they're actually pressed on a taper, and the best way to get those off is to get a couple of hammers. And again, you don't want to use heat or anything because the seal is just behind there, but a couple of hammers will jar it off because it is on a taper. They take a bit sometimes. You can see that's just pressed on a taper. There's no keyway, and because the bottom nut's done up so tight, they press on and they do take a lot to get off. But that's how you get them off without damaging anything. Apologies to all you mechanics for using a carpenter's hammer, but it was handy. But the mash hammer is really good for absorbing some of the shock, so there's no sideways stress on the crankshaft. We can pull our cord out of the cylinder now. You do need to be aware that a two-stroke cylinder has ports on the side of it, so you want to just make sure that when the piston pushes up against the cord or the rope that it hasn't actually guillotined a bit of it off and there's some sitting in the port or in the exhaust port. Very rarely that it happens, but it's just to be aware of, and you kind of will feel it as you're putting turning force on the engine. You'll feel if a little bit of the rope's been guillotined off. We will be taking the muffler off shortly and having a look in the cylinder anyway. So now I've got the base plate off. There's nothing stopping us removing the engine. We just have 4 nuts that mount it to the base. Okay, there's the last of the nuts. They just have lock washers under here, which will fall off when I move the engine forward. There we go. So we'll save all those because they can go with the engine if it's indeed in good enough condition to resell, or even just for parts. It's nice to have all the mounting hardware with it. Okay, that's got them. We'll sit the mower back down on its wheels and we can lift the engine up. So the engine will lift off now without any problems. All we have is the air snorkel with the carby control in there, and you do have to be careful. I don't know about other parts of the world, but in Australia, redback spiders love getting in lawnmowers. So if you feel that sort of fine, sticky type web, just be a little bit cautious, because you really don't want to put your finger underneath the cowling and get a redback spider bite. I believe they're very painful. Never actually had one. Seen millions of the spiders. Alright, so we'll unclip this and I'll show you how to get the control cable and the air snorkel off the carby. Alright, hopefully I can do this without getting in your road. The carby is very dirty, as I've said, but it's pretty easy to pull this part out. First you want to take the stop wires out. Right, now there's a hose clamp around the air snorkel, which we'll just get some pliers on and remove that. Just a spring clamp. So this will now pull off and we're left with a throttle cable. I think you can see that runs down the inside of the air snorkel, and the only way to get this out is to have the throttle control at the stop position, and that allows, there's a little ball on the end of it that allows that to click out of the cam. There we go. Can you see that? So it's a little bit of an angle thing to get it in and out, and you do need to have the throttle in the stop position, otherwise the ball tracks around and it sort of traps it within the housing. So now that that's off, our engine is completely separated. So we'll move the base off the table for now, and we'll have a look at the engine and just see if it's going to be in usable condition and see what we reckon we can get for it. So here we go. We'll put the spark plug back in the hole just to keep the cylinder clean, stop any muck falling in there. So we have one complete Victa 2-stroke engine, and we're going to take the muffler off because that gives us a window into the cylinder, and just it'll give us a good idea of the condition of the engine. So there's a tab that goes under the top blower housing, so we'll have to take that blower housing off, or we could possibly just loosen these 2 bolts, and we'd need to take the head studs nuts off there to get enough room. And then there's just 2 spring-loaded clips. So we'll take that off now and we'll just inspect the engine. But before we do that, let's weigh it. Let's just see what the engine weighs and consequently what we'd get for it for scrap metal. Okay, you're not going to fall off there. And it looks like it's just the capacity of the scale, just under 10 kilos. So that would have to go as dirty shred if you threw that into the if you were taking it to the scrapyard, it'd be dirty shred steel. There's not enough aluminium to really get away with putting it in as ironing aluminium. The crankcase housings are mostly aluminium, and the flywheel mostly is, but you would have a pretty forgiving scrapyard to let you get away with putting that in the aluminium. So at 10 kilos at dirty shred, we were working on 10 cents a kilo. There's $1. I'm sure we can do much better than $1, even if the engine's not much good and we just sell it for parts. But we really want to see what the condition of it's like. So let's inspect the engine. I've taken 2 bolts out of there, 2 out of there, 2 on the other side. I've disconnected the governor hose, which is just plugs into the side. And there is actually another hose which operates a decompressor. So that's unplugged from the carby. So we can pull the top off now. And got a bit of grass build up around the head. That's your decompressor valve. But we're just looking at what condition the engine's like now. There's 2 spring clips, we'll take the muffler off. First thing to check is just that it spins over nicely without any physical impedance. There's no wear to the bearing, there's no sideways movement on the flywheel, and we would have noticed if there had been when the blade disc was on there, but the crankshaft feels good. So we'll pop these clips off just with a screwdriver. They're just a spring steel clip. And there you go, that's how easy it is. The muffler just falls off. There is a small gasket here, which generally you can reuse. So now I'll get the camera and we'll have a look inside. Now I don't remember if I mentioned, but on 2 strokes, the exhaust side of the piston is the side that suffers damage. And let's have a look in here. Alright, we're not focusing too well on the piston there, that's probably better. And it looks like there's some scoring to the piston, so the rings aren't too bad, but there's definitely some score marks to the skirt of the piston, so it's not in very good condition. And I just noticed something as I was pulling the cover off before that might indicate why that happened. The other thing, if you're inspecting an engine and the piston looks okay, you can get a little screwdriver and just press on the rings just to make sure they're not carboned up. They will have a little bit of spring in them, and it gives you a good idea of what condition the rings are in. It's a bit hard to tell with me looking through the camera here. The rings themselves don't look like they're badly damaged, but the piston skirt has been scored, and you need a good seal between the piston skirt and the cylinder to allow the 2-stroke to work, because the fuel air mixture actually goes into the crankcase first, and then as the piston goes down it compresses the mixture in the crankcase and it opens up a port where it travels up through the top. So the rings help with compression at the top end, but the whole piston needs to be in pretty good condition to help with the pressure both ends. So there we go, it's not in the best condition. I think we can still sell it, and I'll probably only put say $10 on it for parts. You can certainly put new cylinders, or you can hone them out. They're a cast iron cylinder, cast aluminium head. You can buy piston kits for Victas fairly cheaply, but I think we'll just put $10 on this for parts. Now, I mentioned why I think it's been done. Well, sometimes you get scoring on a piston on a 2-stroke from poor fuel. It might not have enough oil in the fuel, and then you don't have enough lubrication, and it will score that way. But also, if they run hot and if they run too lean, you can have that issue. Now, they can run hot from a number of reasons. Your cooling fins might be blocked up with grass. We did see some here when we took the cover off, but I did notice underneath all this grime where the carby is, it mounts on a little manifold, and if you see how loose that is, not sure if you can see that moving. So the bolts that hold the manifold to the cylinder have come loose, and it's quite possibly sucking air through there, which will make the engine run lean. And I know that can be a problem with chainsaws. If the inlet manifold sucks air in on the engine side of the carby, the saw will run very lean, it will run very hot, and you will damage the piston cylinder. Anyway, that's enough of a lesson. This was really just a scrapping video. So whilst the engine's not in very good condition, it is complete. and I'm going to put $10 on it for parts in my shop. Much better than just $1 for shred steel. So back to the rest of the mower, let's deal with that. I'm going to take the handle assemblies off, the air snorkel and throttle cable section, and the wheels, axles, and any other little fittings. It won't take very long to do. I don't need to film it. It's not overly interesting. And we'll finish up with a notepad list of various metals and our prices and see how it all adds up for scrap. And there we have it, lawnmower in kit form. The steel here is just it's all clean. I took any plastic bits off it, so that can sell as clean pressing steel. We get a much better price for that. I did notice that all the axles, all the stub axles and the bushings and everything were actually in really good nick. So as rough as this mower was, it actually had not done very many miles. Even the wheels, they'd be the original wheels, and they're more suffering from age than anything. The actual bearings and everything in them are quite good. Anyway, that's beside the point. We have our cast aluminium deck, all nice clean, there's no contaminants in it. We have the original top cowling and the air snorkel and throttle assembly. If it was in better condition, I would keep that as a collectible item for parts, but it's too aged. It's been in the sun, so that's unfortunately going to be scrap. Or sorry, going to be rubbish. You could possibly tempt the buyer of the engine. He may take the throttle assembly and the fuel tank. I'm not going to put that in the shop though. I'll just put the engine in the shop. A little container, a few nuts and bolts, and some various bits of plastic, the bushings and everything. Like I was saying, these bushings really aren't that worn. For a 45-year-old mower, it clearly hasn't done many miles. It's just probably spent most of its life in the shed. Anyway, that will have to be rubbish. So we'll grab the scales, we'll grab a notepad, and we'll get a final tally of what we reckon we can get out of this in dollar terms. We'll start with a nice big cast aluminium deck, and it weighs out at just over 5 kilos. Now the last price I had for cast aluminium was $1.25 a kilo, which is pretty good. I don't remember it being that high for quite a while. In fact, prices generally are pretty good. Cast aluminium, what do we say, 5 kilos at $1.25 is going to be just over $6. We'll say $6. Next we'll weigh up the steel. We've got a bit of a balancing act going on here, but the steel weighs almost 7 kilos. There's a couple of things there. Some of the nicer bolts I'd probably throw into a jar of hardware to sell. The spring I'll probably keep. I actually tend to sell buckets of springs very easily. But as far as scrap steel goes, almost 7 kilos. Steel, 7 kilos. At clean steel, we're going to get about 20 cents a kilo. At the moment, it's pretty good, which would be $1.40. So that's not bad. What have we got left? Well, that's the end of the scrap. We have the wheels, and I have had success selling them at $5 each before. I'm not going to be greedy with these. I'm just going to put, we'll say 10 on the lot. I think someone will buy them for that. Really, it's only plastic. It's no value to anyone else other than a Victa collector or someone that wants a wheel for a little job. They do have bearings in them. I've put the covers back on them. There's circlips in there as well. So we'll say 10 for the lot and see how we go. I'm going to put 10 on the motor. So as usual, we get much better value for second-hand parts than for scrap, which is a lesson, of course. When you do scrap something, is certainly consider that scrap's the lowest value you're going to get. Engine or motor, depends where you're from. Usually an engine. A motor usually refers to an electrical one. $10 as well. And those prices represent pretty good value if someone's into restoring old 70s Victa lawnmowers. So there we go. Initially we had $2.20 if we took it to the scrapyard as was, or as for dirty shred. We could up that a little bit if we got away with sending it for only aluminium at $8.80. And then after scrapping it out, we've got a total of $7.40, $17.40, $27 $1.40. Now, we did keep an eye on the time, and really, if I didn't allow my time for filming, it was under half an hour. It doesn't take long to strip the base. If you find that some of the bolts are really tight, and they're all under there at the moment, most of these undid pretty well. But being a cast alloy deck, where did I put it? Around here. The bolts that hold the axles in, if they seize, don't muck around trying to free them up. One hit with a hammer on the corner of the alloy will break that corner out. Much easier to strip your metal with a hammer sometimes. We're not putting it back together, remember. It would be different if we were trying to rescue the base. But save yourself a bit of time. Get some handy hammer skills. They're actually, it's quite useful, saving time. So there we go. Much better option selling the parts. $8 for the cast aluminium was pretty good. You can see that we did get pretty good value for the irony aluminium because a lot of the weight was in the motor. So that may well represent your best option for scrapping if you don't have an avenue to sell things. $8.80 without doing anything, dropping it off at scrapyard is pretty good, because really, other than the things I can sell, I only got $7.40. Although we would have added the weight of the engine in on that, but it'll be much the same. So the value for me scrapping it out is because I can sell some parts. And you might want to look up eBay for 1970s era Victa lawnmower engines, because they might sell much better than that. You could part it out and sell the carby. You know, you could sell the head, the ignition coil, the flywheel. So there could be good value for someone that has the time and likes to do a bit of eBaying. But as far as scrapping goes, I reckon probably the best option, if your yard will take it as irony aluminium, I reckon that one's probably the best option. Certainly the lowest time for a good return. Okay, thanks for watching. Hope you got something out of that. It was a bit of scrapping. It was a bit of talking about how to repair lawnmowers. It was a bit of just taking things apart and having a yak. Hope you're enjoying my videos. We'll catch you in the next one.